All right, welcome to the first in about 3 videos for Programming 2. Wanted to take some time to do some videos for you all to talk about GUIs. Probably the biggest chunk of this second half of the semester is playing around with GUIs. Your other assignments are related to searching, sorting, recursion, and that sort of stuff that you've sort of looked at already, and sort of builds upon some of the things that you looked at in the first part of the semester, things like methods, but also array lists, arrays, and that sort of stuff. And these searching, sorting, the other assignments that you have for the rest of this class are built on top of that, and it's really easy to find tutorials and that sort of stuff. GUIs, on the other hand, while there are some really good tutorials out there, I wanted to take some time to do some videos just to sort of break apart and give you insight into some of the tutorials that you'll see on building GUIs. So what I've gone ahead and done is created a GUIs folder in the Java Notes Git repo. So I'd suggest if you haven't recently done that, run a Git pull on that so that you can grab those latest notes. Inside of GUIs, I've essentially got 3 different programs. One is customGUI.java, one is wemadlib.java, and the other is actually in its own folder called GUI example. And that's because that's truly more of a full-fledged application. Okay, it's still an example, but more of a full-fledged application. So we'll talk about all 3 of those in separate videos. In this one, we're going to focus on customGUI.java. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start by opening up customGUI.java. I call it customGUI.java because you may see in some tutorials where they say, hey, to create a GUI in Java, they have you use something called the J-option pane. And the J-option pane, it's nice because it sort of bundles all the elements that you need, which we'll talk about here shortly, to create a GUI, and bam. But it's still, J-option panes are really sort of, they're pop-up windows. Think of them as that way. And so you can actually build an entire application that relies on a series of pop-up windows. But to create sort of a custom GUI, that's where you're sort of saying, hey, I want these different components and I want them laid out in this manner and for them to perform this action, so on and so forth. And that's where you have to sort of step beyond J-option panes and switch into actually building your own custom GUI. So that's what we're going to look at in this program here. Now, again, realize that this is really just to show you how to build a custom GUI. It doesn't do much of anything. We'll talk about why that is here shortly. So the main thing is that we're importing in libraries to work with GUIs. And if you'll note, it's import Java X, not Java dot whatever, it's Java X. And that's because all the GUIs, a lot of the AV stuff is in Java X or sometimes even in Java FX. You'll see some people in some tutorials using Java FX, which adds additional fanciness to your GUIs and whatnot. So import javax.swing.star. Swing is the component or widget set that sort of comes by default with Java. Okay, and I say a component or a widget set. Components or widgets, those are things like scroll bars, buttons, list boxes. If you've ever played around with forms in HTML, all those sort of form elements, those are essentially components. Okay, but with GUIs or widget sets, it sort of goes beyond that. That's sort of, it's the back panel, menu bars, all that sort of stuff are considered components or widgets. And there are a lot of different widget sets out there. You may have seen, if you play with Python, you may have seen TK. Perl uses TK a lot. There's GTK. If you play with any Linux stuff, GTK is popular. Qt is one. There's WX widgets. There's a bunch of different widget sets out there. Swing is the one that comes with Java, and you'll see a lot of the tutorials relying on Swing. That doesn't mean you have to use Swing. It just means that that's what a lot of tutorials are written towards because that's what's available. So we're basically saying, give us all the stuff in Swing. And then AWT, that's basically for interacting with the window manager and gives us some of the basic, as opposed to just the components, it's the classes that help us actually work with the window manager, perform actions, and that, when I say perform actions, and you'll see even in later videos how that's really true. I'm talking about actions. But we need that for sort of functionality. The Swing is just the graphics, really. And then AWT is a lot of the underlying functionality that you need. So we've got our class, container, and then a public static void main. Okay. And in this main method, what we're basically doing is building everything. And the process of building a GUI, I'm not going to work through this line by line, but I'm going to point out some highlights to you. If you've ever been to like Hobby Lobby or Michael's or MJ Designs, or I don't even know if Michael's is still open, but anyway, a framing store. What you'll note is that in order to frame a picture, what you essentially do is you take your pictures. Let's say it's going to be one of those things where you have multiple pictures on the side of the same one. Essentially, you put your pictures, whatever your components are, you gather them, you get excuse me, your matting or your back panel, and you have your frame. Well, the first thing you do is you get all those things together, then you take your various components, you set them on your panel, then you take your panel and you put it into the frame. That's exactly what you're doing whenever you're building a custom GUI. So essentially what we're doing here is we set up our frame, okay, because that's going to be the sort of outer structure, the frame or window that things are going to be in. We build a panel, okay, and you'll notice everything's proceeded with J because it's a Java panel, J-frame, all that sort of stuff. And so it's like J-frame frame equals new J-frame, and I pass in options to that constructor. Again, it's the same pattern that you've seen over and over and over again this semester, where you say, boom, data type, name of that object equals new, and you call the specific constructor, whether it's the default constructor, which would be empty parentheses, or an overloaded constructor where you're passing different things to it. So we build a frame, set various elements on that frame. We build a panel, set various elements on that panel, and then we're going to build all of our components. Okay. Things to note when you're sort of looking at this, and again, like I said, I'm not going to read every single line. You all are in programming too. You should be used to analyzing code at this point, saying, okay, I understand this, or if you don't understand it, going up and looking up that information in the API or in documentation. But things to note especially is when creating the frame, one of the things that we need to do is set the default close operation. Because by default, that little X up in the top left corner, assuming you're on a Windows machine. Now, if you're on a Mac, it's not the same. It's the little red blob button circle bubble thing. Yeah. But essentially, that's the same thing. It just looks different. And that, again, goes to widget sets. But essentially, by default, that's just a button. It doesn't have any action tied to it. And so what you have to do is set the default close operation so that when you click it, it actually closes out the window. And if you ever use Skype where you sort of click the X in the Skype window and it doesn't really close it, that's because they didn't set that as they didn't set exit as the default close operation. So you want to make sure you do that so you sort of have a way out or way to kill that without, especially if you don't trigger the program from a command line and can't issue a control C or kill the process that way. With the panel, one of the things that you're going to end up doing, it's important to do is you have to actually set a layout. Okay, so the layout is sort of how will components be added to that panel. Okay? And that essentially, there's a couple different layouts that you can look at. Popular ones are grid layouts, grid bag layouts. I'm actually using a border layout here. It's a fairly simple one where essentially you can put components in north, south, east, west, and the center. Okay, so you have 5 areas that you can drop components into. Fairly basic, fairly simple, but for a non-complex GUI, it works. And I'm skipping past lines like set the frame size and all that sort of stuff, but I'm assuming you figure out what set size does. It sets the size. But create your frame, you tweak it, create your panel, you tweak it, you define a layout for how things will be added, and then you create your various components. And I've got a couple different components in here. So J labels, those are labels. You can put text into them. You can tweak sort of their appearance a bit. I got J buttons, which are buttons. Again, you can tweak their appearance. And again, that's where you would go to the API or the documentation to say, okay, how do I make this button look this way? How do I make it do this? But important to note in there also, I've got a combo box and a list box. And a J combo box actually is made up of, like you've seen in other situations where it's just, okay, here is, think of the J combo box as actually sort of being a data structure because it is actually made up of other things. And so we had to create object arrays in order to put into our combo boxes. And same thing with the J list box, where you have to create an array of strings or an array of objects, depending on what are the requirements for that component. And once you built that, you use that to construct your combo box or your list box or whatever, because it's really an array of things that are then put into this graphical component, this graphical element. Okay, so you can sort of see that there, where I've done that. And again, you can read the API, read the documentation. There are lots of things where they will say, hey, they'll actually break down all these various components. And if we were actually meeting in person, we were going to do that, where each of you were going to sort of look at various GUI elements and sort of talk about them and talk about different ways of playing around with them and tweaking them. But, you know, COVID-19. You do what you do. But you can see right there, I've basically set up several simple little components. And there are other J components out there that you can use. But these are fairly common ones, so you can see how they're done. Once I've tweaked them to my liking, I then add the components into the various areas of the border layout that I want to. Okay. And because of the layout I chose, border layout, I have to say, hey, this is going in the north section or the south section or what have you. Once I put all those components on the panel, I then add the panel to the frame. Basically, boom, stick that in there. Right? And then the last thing I really do is I sort of hang the picture on the wall. And that's the where I essentially set my frame so that it's visible. Okay, that basically says hang it in front of people so that they can see it. And actually what that triggers behind the scenes is a loop. And if you ever play with Python and TK or looking at other things you may see where they trigger, the last thing they do is trigger the main loop. Okay, that is basically a loop that continues to draw that frame on, or that GUI on your screen. It's very similar to those of you that played with processing before, how the draw method doesn't look like a loop, but it is internally set up as a loop, so it keeps drawing it to the screen. Same thing is happening here with the custom GUI, that when we set it visible, it is basically hanging it in front of the user in their graphical user environment or interface environment and continually repainting that to the screen. Okay? Until some action is taken to exit out of it. So we're going to go ahead and exit out of this code. And we will compile it with Java C and custom GUI.java. We'll go through the process, create a custom GUI.class. Now, we don't have to pass in like you did with Finch. We aren't having to do dash class path equals yada yada, or dash class path semicolon, whatever it was, because we're not playing with any funky libraries. We're just playing with the libraries that come with Java, which is again why Swing is used a lot, because boom, the libraries are already there. Okay. Once we've compiled it, to run it, we do Java space and then custom GUI. Do not put .class on the end because it'll complain about unable to find main class, yada yada yada. So Java space custom GUI, we run it. Now, one thing that you may be aware or not be aware of is that sometimes you'll run it and you'll be like, it's just hanging, it's not doing anything. Sometimes, depending on the setting of your machine, it may pop up that Java, that GUI behind whatever behind your terminal or PowerShell or whatever. Okay. This also brings up another thing. If you are using Ubuntu, the Ubuntu Windows subsystem for Linux, okay, I have heard reports that, like, originally they said no GUIs would run out of the Ubuntu Windows subsystem for Linux. I have heard reports that some people say they have gotten it working. I don't know. Try it, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, you can do all your coding and your compiling and that sort of stuff in Ubuntu, and then you simply move it out of the Ubuntu subsystem into sort of the native file system of Windows, and then you can just use the Java runtime environment to run it. And that's also important, like if you're doing development on the Raspberry Pi, you can do the development on the Raspberry Pi and then you simply use WinSCP or CyberDuck or FileZilla to bring it back to your main system to run it. Okay? And that's the nice thing about Java is the .java files are the source code, and then the class files are what you can distribute, which is the runnable code. Okay? So you should see there that you've got a not too exciting GUI. It's the thing about Swing is without a lot of work, it's pretty ugly. It's not the prettiest widget set. Other widget sets are nicer looking. There are ways of playing around with the theme of the widget set, of the Swing widget set. So we'll look in later videos that talk about how you can change the look and feel of various things if you want to change the way that GUI looks. But by default, you're stuck with sort of the Swing look and feel. So, and you can actually click on the buttons, and you'll see they respond like buttons. You can click on the combo boxes and the list boxes, and they act properly. It's just the buttons do nothing because we haven't actually tied any actions to them. And this is where, I kept talking to you all about the idea of, hey, you really want to sort of move towards a modular approach where you're creating methods for everything. That's essentially what you're going to end up doing with these buttons. To tie actions, you're essentially tying methods to specific components so that when that component is activated, a specific method runs or is enacted. And you may even see examples where they directly drop the method in there. You see this more with a lot of the Python and Perl GUI tutorials, where they'll actually just they'll tie a subroutine or a function directly in the construction of, or in the setting of the action or event of the component. You'll sometimes see that in Java, but a lot of times the better method is to, when you start adding events, have a separate method to perform that. Okay? And we'll look at various examples as we go through these next couple of videos. But that's it. If you want to exit out, you just click on the, well, in this case, since it's on a Mac, the little red bubble to exit out of it. And bam, done. Amazing custom GUI that does nothing. But it's actually a good way, if you want to sort of, you can experiment with just creating the GUI, or if you're working in a team, you can, one person can be working on designing the GUI, laying out the interface and all that sort of stuff. And the other person can be working on building the actions and events that are triggered based on any presses. And then you end up tying in those specific events. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for this video. I'll talk to you in a little bit with some other videos.